Dear LP's friends, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. The topic of my lecture will be war and law. In the Western cultural tradition, war has been seen both in a civil secular perspective and in a sacral religious one. From the first perspective, war is essentially conceived as a technical fact. It is not the heroes, the natural gifts, the number of soldiers, or their physical prowess that win, but the technique, the artifice. The greatest writer of war in antiquity, Publius Flavius Vegetius Renatus, commonly known simply as Vegetius, had it clear. The Romans had defeated the gigantic Germani, the brave Hispanics, the rich and treacherous Carthaginians, the refined and educated Greeks only through technique, knowledge of the art of war and training, against ars, that is art, and exercitium, that is training, the virtus indocta, that is the value and the courage of the ignorant, can nothing. From the second perspective, war is an event of which God is the protagonist. In the Old Testament, war was an event that interested the human beings, but God determined its outcome, assuring victory to the chosen people when they were respectful of divine commandments, or condemning them to defeat when they sinned. In the New Testament, war, although it is marginally mentioned as a matter of man's interest, becomes essentially the final clash between good, that is God, of course, and evil, that is Satan, which they also fight, of course, through human beings, but that has nothing to do with their ambitions of domination and conquest, because the stakes are not territories or riches, but eternal salvation. This second perspective is the one that has ended up dominating the philosophical and political discussion, feeding the doctrines of just war and unjust war, which I intend to talk about in my conversation. Although it has been developed mainly in the perspective that I called sacral religious of the Jewish Christian thought, the doctrine of just war seems to have had a form of anticipation in Latin legal political thought, particularly with Cicero. In two passages of the De Re Publica that we know only thanks to Isidore of Seville, Cicero states that, I cite, wars are unjust if they are called without cause. In fact, no war can be considered just except that which is waged for revenge or to drive out enemies. In another passage of the same work, however, Cicero himself recalls that already one of the first kings of Rome, that's to say Tullius Hostilius, had established, according to the principles of the right of the Fiscalis, who, it is well known, were a sort of priests with very important tasks in the matter of relations with other people and especially in the matter of war, that any war, I cite, which had not been announced and declared should be considered unjust and impious. End of citation. Bellum justum, the just war, is therefore essentially the formally correct war, that is, the war which is declared according to the rules. Originally, indeed, the declaration of war was made with a statement that we can define performative in the sense of John Austin. The Fiscalis, in fact, use the formula bellum indico facioque, that is, I declare and make the war, which makes it clear how the very act of declaring the war was itself an act of war. As a matter of fact, then, in Cicero, the war to be just must have its own reason, But this reason is not moral, but legal. To be just, in fact, war must satisfy some substantive and formal conditions that are eminently legal. On the substantive level, it must be motivated by the need to take revenge, to claim stolen goods, or to repel enemies. On the formal level, it must be announced and declared. It is obvious that the formal requirements are eminently legal, but so are the substantive ones, because a war is just when it serves to make up for an injustice, and the same revenge is only a form of reaction to an anti-legal act. Injustice arising from the violation of rights or legally recognized prerogatives. It is therefore the law, not the moral, that counts in the latent legal political tradition. But things change with the advent of Christianity. St. Augustine knew very well that the gospel rejects violence and imposes to hold the other cheek to those who have offended us. But he also knew that if this evangelical message was taken to its extreme consequences, the Christians would have appeared as the destroyers of the political community. How can we imagine following such a precept at a moment when the Roman Empire was attacked by barbarians and ran the risk of being destroyed? For this reason, Augustine, developing a refined reasoning that we cannot retrace here, ends up admitting violence, yes, but affirming with determination that wars cannot be fought sine benevolentia, that is, without benevolence. In any case, war is admitted when it is called because God wants it. That's to say, divine voluntatis causa, because of the will of God. It is what Augustine writes. In this way, however, there was a twofold departure from the Latin tradition that we have seen established by Cicero and from the message of peace of Christ, which is in its radicality did not admit at all any hypothesis of this type. It was connected, this thought, in that way to the idea of the Old Testament war, not to the message of the New Testament, which knew only the war of the highest good against the highest evil, not the war of men among themselves. The discussion among Christian authors on the just war remains for centuries always very, very intense. Of extraordinary importance, as always, is the thought of St. Thomas Aquinas, in which strongly returns the classical approach, according to which, as we have seen, the just war coincides with the legally correct war, in the sense of a war declared according to the rules. Thomas takes up in several points the position of Cicero, although he departs from it by adding as a condition of the just war the intentio bellantium recta, that is, the right intention of the fighters, which ends up mixing a moral element with criteria that are instead essentially legal. Thus, even in Thomas, the question of just war was not entirely replaced by that of legitimate war, and it continued to be investigated by philosophers and lawyers. Moreover, there was also practical interest in solving it, because it was to understand whether the war against the Turks, the main enemies of Christianity, was really justified as precisely right. In this case, two moral arguments ended up prevailing over the legal ones. This was a serious problem, because an unanimous consensus on moral precepts is always difficult to reach, so that the doctrine of just war proved to be a source of uncertainties and continuous conflicts. Controversial, then, was not only the question of whether it was justified to make a war, but also that of how to make a war considered as justly declared. It was mainly the Spanish school of Salamanca that developed the most refined reflections, with the fundamental contributions of Francisco de Vitoria and Francisco Suarez. Here too, the attempt was to move the question of just war away from morality and theology in order to bring it closer to law. The real progress was possible, however, only thanks to John of Legnano, Giovanni da Legnano, who had already indicated this way in the 14th century, very early, and especially in the 16th century, thanks to Alberico Gentili, who is the true founder of the new secularized international law. It is Gentili, much more than Grotius, still bound to the moral doctrine of just war, that strips the doctrine of war from all its moral or theological connotations and allows the law in this way to take over the regulation of war, giving a shape to something that appears to be completely shapeless. We can't forget, obviously, that already Cicero, in the Pro Milone oration, had said that silent leges inter arma, that is, laws are silent between weapons. But in the same Roman legal thought, we find the principle lex semper loquitur, that is, the law always speaks, so that we can say that the noise of weapons makes it difficult to hear the voice of law, but it cannot silence it completely. Shifting the focus from morality or theology to law means moving from a doctrine of just war to a doctrine of legitimate, or still better, legal war, that is, of a war corresponding to specific legal norms. Saying just war, or legitimate war, or even more legal war, is not the same thing. In the same legal language, just, legitimate, and legal mean very different things, that is, correspondence to an ideal model, existence of a foundation for the power exercised, or respect for the law. And only on the concept of legal war, in the sense of a war permitted by specific legal norms, of course, whatever moral appreciation each one wishes to give, only in this case it is possible to understand each other. This is why the recent revival of the idea of morally just war, which has been promoted by a part of the Anglo-Saxon doctrine, gives rise to great concern. The most well-known author is undoubtedly Michael Walzer, but we must not forget scholars such as Brian Orend, or, confirming the influence exerted outside the English-speaking world, Alessandro Ferrara. Walzer acknowledges that he owes a debt to the religious doctrine of just war. He writes, "It is a good theory. We remain indebted to the Catholic theologians who invented it centuries ago." And he openly criticizes the lawyers. I quote, "The lawyers have constructed a paper word." In doing so, he tries to reintroduce into the modern world concepts and philosophical principles clearly pre-modern, with the consequence that the concept and definitions to be used to establish a minimum of norms by which to regulate war remain completely uncertain. This thesis is very dangerous and excessively justifies the recourse to war. Walzer, in fact, re-evaluates both the doctrine of preventive defense, legitimizing it not only in the case of imminent attack, but also in that of sufficient threat, and the doctrine of the just intervention of individual states or of individual groups of states in the internal affairs of other states in order to safeguard human rights, at least when, he writes, the violation of human rights is terrible. Well, you can see very well, sufficient threat, terrible violation. These are completely vague and undetermined concepts, which do not allow to have clear ideas about what is permitted and what is not. A not surprising outcome, precisely because the doctrine of just war is heavily conditioned by assumptions of moral nature, as always subject to discussion and dissent. Such an opinion legitimates interventions to protect human rights with measures that sacrifice the human right par excellence, that is, the life, in the name of moral precepts that are totally subjective. And Walzer and the others who support this position poorly consider international law, assuming a clearly anti-legalistic perspective. The risks produced by the doctrines that resurrect pre-modern categories makes actual again the need that Alberico Gentili seemed to have satisfied once and for all at the end of the 16th century, replace the theological moral pretensions with a legal neutralization of the conflicts. Theorizing the just war simply means opening the door to a more permissive use of force far beyond what the United Nations Charter allows. And it means not understanding that every conflict, even the seemingly most irrelevant, can lead to nuclear war, which certainly can never be qualified as just, since it leads to the destruction of humanity. Admit a conflict because it is just is therefore always wrong. Contrary to what the theory of just war holds, it is more in the United Nations Charter and more generally in international law that the solution of the serious problems posed by war must be found. The rules of the Charter are unambiguous. Article 2 of the Statute, as everybody knows, states that all members shall settle their international disputes by peaceful means in such a manner that international peace and security and justice are not endangered. And so does Article 51, first period, reserving to the United Nations the right to declare the war. It is evident, as a matter of fact, that in this way the states are almost entirely dispossessed of the jus ad bellum, which is transferred to the United Nations, while only the legitimacy of self-defense is conferred. However, two problems remain unresolved. First, that there are no means to apply these rules when a conflict is triggered by one of the great powers. Second, that the right understanding of the formal concept of war is sometimes contested, so that the boundaries between international police operations and real military operations are not always clear. The fact that some wars were not so qualified just because they were humanitarian, or the fact that in his speech of February 24th, 2022, the Russian president gave the name of special military operation to the conflict in Ukraine are very significant. We could therefore speak of a limited efficacy of the international law. Nevertheless, law still has a role of enormous importance because, at least in many cases, it prevents risks and conflicts and can promote the right balance between the different interests. Legal scholars should engage themselves in maintaining the more classical conception of war and not giving in to the temptation to admit military interventions in other countries just because they are humanitarian or democratic, or because they are formally called special military operations. War is war, whatever its purpose, and if it is not only defensive, it is forbidden by international law, nothing less and nothing more. Thank you very much for your kindness.